All right. Hi. How's everybody doing late in the afternoon? Anyone tired? I'm starting to get a bit tired. So, hi everybody. As mentioned, I'm a senior engineer at Human Made. It's lovely to be here speaking to you guys today about how to scale an API to 23% of the web. But we'll get back to that in just a sec. First, I want to start out, what API are we actually talking about here? So we're talking about the REST API project that's intended for WordPress core. We're aiming to get it merged in sometime in 2015 is the hope. If you haven't heard of the API before, this slide tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the API. Obviously, we have lots of sharks, castles, rainbows, just everything you need. If you seriously haven't heard of the API, there's a great introduction over at Post Status, written by Brian Krogsgaard, that very nicely summarizes the entire project, the history, everything that we're trying to do with it. I'm going to go off the assumption that most people have kind of heard of the API at least, which is kind of a bit self-centered, but yeah, whatever. So, still talking about what API here, I want to give you a bit of an intro to how the project actually works. With the project, we have quite a few contributors. So, firstly, there's myself and Rachel Baker. We're the lead developers on the project, and we make the sort of bigger decisions and things like that, and lead the project. We also have a number of contributing developers, Daniel Buckhuber and Joe Hoyle, who are both here at LoopConf. Our main contributing developers for version 2. And we have 53 total contributors, which is pretty decent. So the main version that everybody has pretty much used of the REST API is version 1. So version 1, obviously, is the first version of the API. Version 1 was intended to be our proof of concept. Basically, it's proving out all the ideas that we have in the REST API, making sure that it can actually work in production, that it's useful and things like this. And it seems like we actually did a pretty good job. It's being used in production at places like New York Times and Wired. It has full backwards compatibility across every 1.x release, sorry. So 1.1 is fully backwards compatible, 1.2 likewise, following the same sort of process that WordPress core does. And that's kind of painful for us because we actually have to deal with both internal compatibility with our PHP APIs, as well as external compatibility with the JSON and the REST part of that. So, just recently, we released version 2 of the API. So, version 2, despite it being a new major number, is actually the next iterative version of the API. And it's the exact same code base, but just modified further. Can you guys hear me correctly? It sounds like my breathing might be coming through a bit, so apologies for that. So with version 2, we're asking ourselves, what did we actually learn from version 1? What's the feedback that's coming back to us from plugin and theme developers? And what have we heard from client authors as well? Basically, we're trying to work out what works and what doesn't, and what can we actually improve. So with version 2, we went and rethought a bunch of the internals of the API. Basically, it turns out that the external version, all the stuff that clients interact with, is actually pretty great. But the internals needed quite a bit of work. And that's to get things like plugins and themes using the API a little better. So some of the things we did there were standardizing internal naming. Before we had quite a few functions, but they were named similarly and not the same. And we tried to converge those to a more consistent sort of scheme, I guess. And we've tried to make the internals more extendable and reusable for plugin and theme developers, with the idea that basically if you want to go and build things on top of the REST API, you don't have to reinvent a lot of the work that we're already doing. And we're also trying to force ourselves to use our own best practices. And to do that, we've restructured some of the internals so that it's impossible for us to write things that don't follow best practices. With version 2, we also broke backwards compatibility intentionally. So version 1 is completely backwards compatible. Version 2, however, we had a chance to throw away a few of the things in version 1 that we didn't like. So one of the key things here is actually with the term split that happened. Originally, I actually screwed up what the plan was there, and because of that, some of our routes were slightly incorrect. So with version 2, we took the opportunity to remove some of that cruft, and so that we're not left with it moving forward into the future. But that's not to say that we're not going to ever have backwards compatibility. The plan is to release a final version 1 branch that is essentially just a wrapper around version 2 and lets people keep working with their version 1 code using the version 2 core of the API. The other major change that we made with version 2 was moving everything to a more standardized model. So there's this concept of hypermedia in APIs, where basically you have all of your resources, so things like posts, users, stuff like that, and those link out to other things. So it's similar to hyperlinks in HTML. With version 2, we tried to standardize on what the general APIs out there in the world are doing. And we decided to use HAL, which is the Hypertext Application Language, which is a quite nice specification that lets clients interoperate nicely. And it was quite similar to what we were already using on the API. We also built more schema data into the API. Basically, the schema data lets clients understand what the response is that they're getting back. I'm going to talk about a little bit more about that later as well. And we also took inspiration from the PSR 7, which is the PHP standard recommendation, which is being developed at the moment by a group of different frameworks in the PHP world. And so we're actually using some of that already. But I know what you're all thinking. Wasn't this talk about scaling an API? Yeah, it was. So sorry about that. So let's get on to the meat of the subject. How do we scale an API? So I need to clarify for a second what scale actually means in this context. Obviously, I'm not talking about this sort of scaling. This is not really relevant to anything that we're doing here, so let's not talk about that. But also, I'm not talking about performance scaling. So if you want to hear about performance, go speak to Zach Tolman. I'm sure he would love to take your questions. But this is not about how to handle performance with the REST API. What we are talking about is scaling across sites, across add-ons, which is plugins and themes, and scaling across clients. So how do we interoperate with all of these things that come into the long tail of 23% of the web? These are all different focuses, and sometimes they're actually at odds with each other, which can make balancing them quite a tricky task. So the first one I'm going to speak about here is consistency, which is scaling across the different sites. When we launch this API, it's going to be pretty useless if the sites don't all speak the same API. If they don't do this, sites can't talk to each other, clients cannot talk to all of the sites without having special code for each site. So this is a very important one. So the aim with making the API consistent is you want to be able to write your clients once and have them work everywhere. So no matter what site you're connecting to, it should be consistent across the board. Obviously, in an ideal world, every site would just install the plugin and the API would look completely the same. But of course, in reality, that's not true, because sites can remove things. So plugins can go and remove endpoints that they don't like, replace them with their own instead. Themes can remove data that they don't need, or site owners might decide to remove data because of privacy concerns. So the question is how we deal with this. Attempting to lock down this data wouldn't work. The problem is that we don't really control the entire system. We're a plugin running on WordPress, but there's so much involved with actually serving up this site. So if we decide to lock it down, people will just work around it. In the worst case scenario, people will output buffer the entire page, JSON decode it, delete what they want, JSON encode it again, and then push it out. And we really don't want that to happen. but there's no way that we can prevent it. So instead, we need to rethink this. Rather than locking it down, how do we make it so that people are discouraged from doing this? So what we've mainly done in version 2 is we have introduced schemas as a standard way to describe data. Basically, this is a machine-readable way of understanding what you're going to get back. It tells you what the types of different things are. It includes human-readable documentation as well. And it's essentially like making our own specification, like HTML or CSS. We've actually had schemas around since day one, but originally they were part of the documentation with the API. This meant that they often fell out of date with the current state of the API. With version 2, we're trying a slightly different tack with that by baking them into the endpoints themselves. And so they're actually used in part of generating the responses, ensuring that essentially they can't fall out of date. Obviously, those schemas aren't perfect. They don't solve all of our problems. They aren't a magic bullet. They describe a perfect scenario. They're still describing best case scenario, what you get back from the API. But they don't tell clients how to handle failures. If I go and remove parts of that data, how should a client handle that? And so we need to tell clients essentially how we're going to handle this data and what to do essentially when an error occurs. You can see the same sort of thing happen with the HTML5 specification, which codified all of the error handling built into browsers previously. We want to teach clients to expect the worst, but obviously be pleased when you get the best. With consistency as well, we also need to structure to encourage best practices across all of our own code and across all of the plugins and themes that are going to be extending this. So instead of forcing plugin and theme developers to go and learn REST and redo the things that we've done, we try and make that as easy as possible. Rather than having to learn about what get and post and put and patch and delete do, instead we have helpers. So you can mark things as readable, editable, creatable, or deletable, which is pretty understandable for pretty much anyone. And that removes a lot of the pain of having to learn all of these things that we're already doing. We also try and encourage people to do things the right way. So for example, adding new routes or endpoints has a nice easy helper. You just call a function and it's done. Removing routes, on the other hand, requires low-level hooks. So you actually need to look at the internals of the API to work out how to do it. It's possible, but it's not easy. And we're trying to make it easy to do the right thing and possible to do everything else. We're also very much leading by example here. So in all of our own endpoints, we have full schema usage. As I said, we're baking that in, and we're making it so that the schemas can't fall out of date with our endpoints. We also act as an example for people who want to go and implement APIs on top of it. So we sort of describe the best way on how to version things and how to structure all of your internal code. So the second part of how we scale an API is talking about extensibility. So extensibility is making sure that things work across all of the plugins and all of the themes that you're going to go install. Extensibility is obviously very much related to the best practices that I was just talking about, but it also has concerns of its own. So one important point with extensibility is how we encourage discovery. Essentially, if I'm running a plugin on my site, how does a client learn that I'm running that plugin? If I have WooCommerce, how does it work out that the WooCommerce API is available? In version 1, we had a very basic form of this discovery. So we just listed out all of the routes that were available on the site. And that's kind of okay most of the time, but the problem is that that's not really that flexible. We're still working out in version 2 how we're going to do this. We've got some ideas. We're adding further things to the next betas coming up. We're also looking at what people do in the wider universe as well. So looking at APIs that already exist and that already have to tackle some of these problems. So we have to be careful with these, not to bite off more than we can chew. there's a lot of problems that can come into here, and it's very tempting to try and attempt to fix all of them at once. There's this concept in the hypermedia world of having clients that can auto-generate UIs based on types. And that's great, but it's also somewhat unrealistic. At this point, we haven't invented artificial intelligence, so we can't have clients that automatically learn things like this and they don't understand human-readable language. We can certainly help them out, but that doesn't mean that we should try and solve all of these problems at once. We need to balance what we're actually doing with the time and the effort that we have available. One thing that helps us do that is the core fields API and the associated UI. So some of you might know this as the metadata fields UI. Essentially, this is trying to create a system of named fields for core that will add UI automatically for you. We can actually use quite a lot of the stuff that they're doing there because essentially they have name types and we want to have name types too. And so by leaning on that team instead of trying to do it ourselves, we remove a lot of the issues related to that. It also helps us make sure that WordPress core at the end of the day is coherent. We don't want to have 5 different types, 5 different styles of types in core. Hopefully someday we'll end up with clients that can generate UI automatically, but this is not really realistic right now. We need to be careful to avoid that. So the third component of how to scale an API is talking about usability. So usability is working out how do we get everything to work across all of the different clients. Having clients be able to auto-generate UI would be great, like I said, but they can't right now. So in the meantime, we need to help them work with the data that we have right now. So usability has a number of concerns. One of the main ones is network data. One of the key differences between desktops and mobile applications is the network. With mobile networks, you have a lot more latency. You have a lot of speed issues as well. And so obviously you don't want to send and receive more data than you actually need. So we've had quite a few feature requests in version 1 for including or excluding individual fields. We don't really want to bake that into the API right now, but instead what we're looking at is creating essentially a feature plugin for the REST API, so a feature plugin for a feature plugin that would add this ability for including and excluding fields into a separate plugin. And we can test that out, work out how it should look, essentially, and then integrate it in at the end of the day if we like it. One other thing that mobile apps have to deal with is trying to minimize the number of requests they have. So the latency issue comes into play here. If you have to wait 100 milliseconds for any request, then getting a post and then getting the author data and then getting further data from that is going to take the minimum amount of time it can take is the latency to and from the server. And so batch requests were another thing that was asked for quite a bit in version 1 of the API. Batch requests are essentially trying to do multiple requests in a single call across the network. So we haven't added batch requests in, but what we have done is something similar, which is called enveloping. It's called embedding. And so embedding essentially allows you to get a single item, like a post, and then also get everything related to that. So a post author, the terms associated with that post, and get all of those back in a single request. We may actually add full batch requests someday, but we haven't quite worked out how that should look yet. And so again, we're trying to leave that until we actually need it. So enveloping is another technique that we have. Because essentially, a lot of people can't rely on HTTP. If you're in a browser, for example, and you send a request, that browser will automatically follow any redirects. And that's great most of the time, but when you have things that rely on that URL not changing, it can break. So OAuth, for example, for authentication, breaks immediately as you try and do that. Enveloping helps us get around that. And essentially with enveloping, we say that we don't trust the HTTP client that you're actually working with. So what we do is you can send a request that sends an override method. So obviously here we're sending a post request, but we're also saying override this and set it to put. Internally in the API, this actually gets changed to a put request. And all of the API endpoints can't actually tell the difference between these two. We have the same concept on the output as well, where we also don't trust the HTTP client. So instead, we can pass in an envelope parameter, and that lets us take the request, the response that we have, and essentially ignore the real data. Instead, we embed it a level deep and keep it all in the actual data itself, and just always return a 200 OK. So the idea here is that rather than browsers handling it, you can handle it a level higher at the application layer. One of the other things with usability that we have to deal with is authentication. And so right now we have OAuth 1.0a. This is not the latest version of the specification. The latest version is version 2. But version 2 currently relies on SSL. And SSL is not actually available across all sites. We cannot depend on that for something that's going out to 23% of the internet. So instead, we have to use 1.0a. And that's quite a lot harder to use, but it's the only way for us to get interoperability across all of these sites. But we do some nice things with OAuth. So essentially, if you have any parameters that you need to pass in for the authentication, you can pass those either in the authorization header, which is the standardized way of doing it, or in the URL, which is a way essentially of saying that, if you don't have access to headers, you can send it this way instead. It's still not entirely the greatest to work with. We know about this, and we're definitely trying our best to try and improve it. So finally, I'd like to talk about future problems for WordPress. We haven't actually fixed all of the issues that exist with using an API, and there's going to be some important changes that need to be made in the future of using the API and using WordPress as well. We're going to have to, as developers, go through some structural and mental shifts. So one of those is dealing with enqueuing and conditionals. Essentially right now, the best practice is that you shouldn't enqueue a script unless it's actually used on the page. But with a REST API in play, you don't know what the page that you're on is. You could start out at the home page and then browse through to the archive page without the scripts ever getting loaded back in. And so we need to deal with what happens when our conditionals lie to us, essentially. Maybe we need to introduce concepts of enqueuing and conditionals on the client side. One of the other things that we need to deal with is hooks. So again, people use conditionals inside of hooks. This is not the worst practice, but it's definitely going to start breaking when you start using the REST API. It's also going to break with people that rely on hooks inside themes. So the Theme Hook Alliance back in the day had I think it was after content hook, that would let you output buttons or whatever you'd like after the content had been fired. The problem is with a REST API, you don't actually know when that's going to be. That's kind of a pain. We're going to have to deal with clients rendering it on the JavaScript side as well as on the PHP side, and things will become a lot less predictable here. We also need to start thinking about privacy implications. So a lot of the data that, well, in fact, all of the data that the API currently exposes is already public, but people don't necessarily know this. So the API, for example, exposes author data for every post, and that includes a lot of data that they might see as private. But the thing is, this is already exposed in things like RSS feeds. And I think moving forward into the future, WordPress is going to have to be better at exposing the implications of what you're actually posting. Perhaps we need to add admin UI that tells you whether something is visible in the RSS feed or something like that. We haven't solved all of these problems, but we're going to have to eventually. All of these things are going to happen at the end of the day. We can't stop it. And so we're going to have to change our best practices and our way of thinking and things like that. So, I mean, I don't have all the answers. I'm hoping that some of you guys can start working that out. For everybody who is building things with the API, thank you. But we also need to be very careful about shaping the world that we want to see with the API and the future of WordPress. Thank you.